The debate this morning we're going to consider is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, champion of liberty or opponent of liberty? And this is one of those structured debates similar to William F. Buckley's firing line, or what you might have debated in high school debate class or college. The structured debate is not a panel where there's a lot of interruption, nor is it a court scene where there is cross-examination, but it is the presentation of a case and its opposite, then rebuttal, and then we'll have questions from the audience with a roving microphone in the last 10 minutes or so of the presentation. Now, I am a market historian. That's one job I do at Navalier.com, and my column this week is about this week in market history, one of the most dramatic weeks ever. July 11th to 15th, 1932, same days of the week as this week. On Friday, July 15th, 1932, the Dow was up 10% for the week, and even more astounding, it was up 80% in 7 weeks from July through August. And what was the news that made that happen? It was the Democratic National Nominating Convention in Chicago, which closed on July 2nd, nominating Franklin Delano Roosevelt. All of a sudden, the world was astir with the wonderful news that a new man would save us and come into the White House, because they knew he would win, because everybody seemed to want him to win. So the market went up, and it kept going up during the whole first term. It was the most rapid market increase in 5 years or less in market history, up 372% from mid-July of 32 to March 10th, 1937. The bad news is then it collapsed 50% in the next year and never got above about 150 during the entirety of the rest of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's unprecedented 4 terms, which amounted to just 12 years and a little bit over till he died in April of 1945. So our question before us today is, Franklin Delano Roosevelt a champion of liberty? Well, the market said yes, and then it said no. In other words, it went up very fast, then it went down. I am going to introduce this second speaker in a minute, but first of all, I want to introduce Conrad Black by Skype on the telephone, a Renaissance man, a publisher and an author of several books, not just about FDR, but about Nixon, a misunderstood president, and maybe a misunderstood nation of Canada. He's written a history of Canada, Ascent to Greatness, I believe it was called. Rise to Greatness, the history of Canada. And I would like him to present the basic case in the next 10 minutes that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a champion of liberty. Mr. Black?
Thank you. I believe that was Mr. Alexander speaking. I can't see you, but from the description of the odds of 2,000 to 1 against me, I feel fortunate that as the Christian among the lions, I'm doing so at such a distance, indeed, from another country. I must say, express astonishment throughout that, couched in the manner that the question is, there would be any doubt at all that President Franklin D. Roosevelt was one of the greatest champions of liberty there has ever been. Let us review, and you touched upon it, Mr. Alexander, very briefly, the circumstances in which he took the great office of president. The unemployment rate was between 25 and 33%. Statistics were fuzzy because the Department of Commerce didn't keep them. They were tabulated on a state-by-state basis, and some states just guessed at it. There was no federal relief for them. Approximately 20% of the population was in imminent danger of having mortgages foreclosed. And every stock exchange and commodity exchange in the country had been closed for some time. Banks were closed in 46 states, and in the other 2 states, withdrawals were confined to $10 per withdrawal. The entire financial system had collapsed, and the country was in a state of economic and psychological degradation. For the first time since the Civil War, there were machine guns at the corners of the great federal buildings in Washington on Inauguration Day. I want to clear that I am a capitalist, as I surmise most of you are, and more or less of a pure capitalist, and there's some things Roosevelt did that I do not agree with. But he said in his famous inaugural address, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," that there would be mistakes, some things wouldn't work, those would be discarded, and other things would be tried. But what was needed was action. And as you know, most of you, I think, and certainly the 80-year-old gentleman you saw on the way in today would remember it, he reopened the banks, guaranteed the bank deposits. The Homeowners Loan Corporation was set up and rewrote 4 million mortgages, saving the homes of approximately 20 million people in a population of about 125 million. In the 4 years you described where the stock market made the great rise that you mentioned, unemployment, outright unemployment, was reduced from approximately 14 million to approximately 8 million, and of those 8 million, 6 million were in his workfare plans, and the labor force increased in that period by an additional 6 million. So the effective rate of unemployment came down from around 30% to, if you count the people in the workfare programs as unemployed, as they officially were counted, about 13%. But if you count them as employed, the unemployment rate came down to about 5%, which is quite close to what it is today. Now, there has been a debate that I instigated between historians about the calculation of unemployment in Roosevelt's period as president. I have been critical, though I admire them in other ways, of the docility of some pro-Roosevelt historians, Doris Kearns Goodwin, William Leuchtenberg, and my late friend Arthur Schlesinger, for accepting the adversarial view that Roosevelt's performance in the reduction of unemployment was uncompetitive with that of Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, and the British and French and Japanese. The reason for that was that, in the first place, in Stalin's case, you couldn't believe any of his statistics, and he rather skewed the figures by murdering huge numbers of his countrymen, which did reduce the numbers considerably. But in the case of the others, both the democracies and the dictatorships, the unemployed were effectively drafted into the armed forces or into defense production industries, which was a process the United States only got to once the war had started. Now, what Roosevelt did in these conservation and workfare programs was much more surely employment than these artificial rates of conscription by the dictators and by the British and French to respond to the dictators. And it was much more useful work for the country. Those who built the Triborough Bridge, the Lincoln Tunnel, the state capitol at Helena, Montana, the Inland Waterway, the Chicago waterfront, the Tennessee Valley Authority, all of these projects built at an absolutely bargain cost, hundreds of national parks, of highways, all manner of improvements, infrastructure as we call it now, as well as immense conservation projects, down to and including having Eugene O'Neill teach people how to write. All of that was real employment, and the remaining unemployed were in fact taken care of from 1935 on the Social Security system. And I think that in your question of subsequent to that, he was an opponent of freedom, we have to take into account we were entering a wartime economy. In 1937, he responded to the balance the budget, low spending advocates in his own party, as he'd responded to the bimetallists with the bill favored in your state of Nevada by then Senator Key Pittman for the Silver Purchase Act. He balanced his party, he kept it in order, he always preserved the moral integrality of the country. If he had ever said the Rockefellers and the Fords and the Morgans will pay for this, the mobs would have burned their houses down. He never did it. He laid the blame on fictitious categories of people. on economic royalists, malefactors of great wealth, war profiteers. There were no such people. It was rubbish. It was merely a way of mobilizing in a harmless way the anger and frustration of the people in order eventually to focus public anger and fear at America's real enemies, who were the Nazis and the imperialist Japanese. And he did do that. He knew Germany well. He spoke German as well as French. The first school he ever went to was in Germany. He knew some of the officials of Hitler's government from earlier times, Franz von Papen, the vice chancellor, and Hjalmar Schacht, the finance minister. He said all along it was going to come to war, and he gradually transformed the workfare programs from the sorts of things that I mentioned into naval construction and munitions manufacturing. The famous aircraft carriers Yorktown and Enterprise were built under supervision of Navy architects by the unemployed. And he brought the country to a steady state of preparation for war. And since all I see in front of me now is a swirling signal and I hear nothing, I'm operating on the optimistic supposition that someone is hearing me. And I will conclude at this point by saying that since I'm to cover the whole range of his term, I'll do the rest of it in the next interlude. But the fact is, in the summer of 1940, all of the Eurasian landmass was in the hands of Hitler, Stalin, and the imperialist Japanese, except for the British Indian Empire, a bit of Arabia, and a few neutral states in Europe. France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Russia were all in the hands of anti-democratic regimes hostile to the English-speaking world. In the summer of 1945, all of those countries, except the Soviet Union, were in the hands of the English-speaking countries, and the Russians had taken over 90% of the casualties required in subduing Germany. We have chiefly Franklin D. Roosevelt to thank for that. That was the triumph of democracy, and with the GI Bill of Rights, he completed the process of turning the unemployed working class of the 30s into a middle class in the 50s and set the stage for the greatest growth and period of leadership in American history. Thank you.
And thank you very much. That came in at just under 9 minutes, so you have time in the bank.
If I have 1 minute more, I'll take it. Or can I add it later?
You have 1 minute more, yes.
Oh, well, this didn't just happen. Roosevelt planned not all of it in advance, but each phase of it. He always integrated into his own thinking how the international situation would have an impact upon domestic policy. And he always realized that if the United States was not engaged in preventing regimes hostile to American values to take control in Europe and in the Far East, everything, the whole future of democracy would be at risk every generation. And that isolation, which he'd fought as a secondary member of the Wilson administration at the end of World War I, had to be defeated. And he did do that. And I just want to say, since I am a capitalist speaking to capitalists, I agree with what I suspect the next speaker is going to say, not to presume, that he underestimated the danger of high taxes, and he did take a step toward inflation because he felt that a graduated inflation was less dangerous than deflationary cycles reaching such a terrible depression as occurred in the early 30s. I think that if he had survived to fill his fourth term, he would have taken corrective measures to put the dollar and promote a hard currency system generally. And he certainly wished a reconciliation with the business community after its immense services during the war. We didn't know as much in the 30s as we do now about what produces economic growth. And I'm certainly not whitewashing his record. But I put it to you, to all of you, that what he achieved in taking the United States from the desperation of 1933 to 1945, when it had half the economic product of the world, a monopoly of atomic weapons, and had completely defeated Nazism and fascism and imperialist Japanese, the imperialist Japanese regime, with the Soviet Union taking 90% of the casualties doing it, was rivaled only by President Lincoln as the greatest performance by a president and the greatest service to human liberty. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your applause. And that's 11 minutes, and I'm keeping pretty strict time here on my stopwatch, so we'll give everyone equal time. Robert Murphy, an economist. I've read 4 of his books. I can recommend them all. The newest, I believe, is Chaos, Cooperation, Enterprise, and Human Action, a guide to Ludwig von Mises' Human Action. He also wrote Lessons for the Young Economist, an excellent first book to read on economics. And to our point in this debate, he wrote The Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism, and for this debate, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal. Welcome, Robert Murphy.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Mr. Black, for your participation in this. I just want to note something ironic. I don't know if you guys caught that, but right at the end there, when he had some time left, he said, "Oh, I still have a minute left in the bank. I guess I'll use it." It's a good thing our moderator didn't behave as FDR and declare a banking holiday and say, "Nope, you can't access your savings," right? So let me acknowledge I'm at a bit of a disadvantage here in terms of the formal structure of the debate, because for those who strolled in, at the beginning when the moderator polled the audience, every single person was against FDR, and so at this point I can't possibly win. All I can do is lose, so let me at least try not to lose with my remarks. But let me give you more reasons to more fully appreciate why FDR is not, in fact, a hero of liberty. So I was taking notes, of course, as Mr. Black was speaking. In the 5-minute rebuttal that's going to come up after this, I will address his points. Let me here sort of just start from a blank slate and try to make the negative for this proposition: is FDR a hero of liberty? Now, I'm a professional economist. I am not by any stretch a military historian, so I will allude to certain events, just try to give you big picture patterns here. But I do want to just say that, of course, my area of expertise is economics, but I think that would be too easy if I just focus narrowly on economic topics. And I also think for Freedom Fest, if I might generalize a bit, I'm pretty sure just about everybody who comes to this, except last year when Paul Krugman was invited, is a fan of the free market and laissez-faire. Yes, let's give a round of applause for Paul Krugman. Is a fan of the free market in terms of domestic interventions, not having people intervene in the economy. Politicians make things worse in terms of fix social problems at home. And yet, though, there are a lot of self-described conservatives, people on the right, who are fans of an aggressive, strong U.S. government when it comes to foreign policy. So I want to talk about that at the end. And so what Mark Skousen had given us in terms of this debate is he wanted us to focus both on the economics, saying, is FDR a champion of liberty because he got us out of the Depression? That's a standard thing. And then he led the U.S. to become the superpower that it is today. So I want to say for both of those reasons, when we understand what really happened, you'll conclude with me that FDR was not, in fact, a champion of liberty. So just some random things here, just off the top of my head. I mean, FDR, regardless of how you want to say whether the U.S. should have gone into World War II or not, but certainly having large-scale internment camps, that's not something that strikes one as something that's a hero of liberty would do. When it comes to monetary policy, Mr. Black alluded to it at the end there, but it wasn't simply that he devalued the dollar and increased the price of gold, but in order to make that stick, FDR had to order people to turn in their gold. He confiscated it, and that was backed up by stiff prison sentences and fines. All right, again, that's not the mark of someone who's devoted to liberty, that to get your way to have your economic program go through, you lock people up for holding gold. Another thing you may not be aware, John Flynn was a commentator at the time from the right, just exposing the horrors of the New Deal and just what an outrageous expansion of federal power that was. And there were cases of, so what the government was doing, they would set up proposals and fix prices, fix output quotas and so forth for various industries. And again, these weren't mere suggestions coming forward from D.C., these were things that were backed up by the point of a gun. And there are cases of people in trench coats kicking in doors of factories at night, coming in, making people go out in the streets, looking at their books, and as Flynn puts it, all for the for the crime of sewing pants at night. All right, so these are some of the things that happened under this alleged paragon of liberty. And so if one wants to argue, well, it was necessary in order to fix the economy and so forth, it was regrettable. But I want to say not only were these obvious prima facie violations of abstract principles of liberty, they didn't work. All right, so let me, in the interest of time here, I don't have much left. Let me just give you some statistics. So as far as unemployment, and it's true that Mr. Black talked about this, but I would say if I want to make the case that FDR did not get us out of the Depression and made things worse, I'm happy just to put the evidence forward of the unemployment rate. So it's true when he came in 1933, the unemployment rate was about 25% that year. And so you could say, well, he didn't really have much time, that was the legacy from Hoover. And it started coming down, but still, in 1937, the unemployment rate was still 14%. All right, and then it jumped up to 19% in 1938. And in fact, it did not get below double digits until 1941. All right, so remember, FDR was elected in 32. So fully 2 terms into his administration, he finally got the unemployment rate to be below double digits. So I would say to you, what would history have to look like for us to conclude that the New Deal made things worse? All right, every recession or depression with a small d ultimately ended in U.S. history. Right? It wasn't the previous presidents just sat around and depressions went on forever and ever. They all came to an end, and yet for some reason there was something special about the 1930s that made this thing just keep dragging on and on and on. And again, I just want to underscore in case you missed the statistics there, it wasn't merely that it was going down slowly but steadily. It had gotten down to 14% and change by 37, and then again jumped up 5 percentage points back up to 19% in 38. All right, so he had been in office for 5 years at that point, and the unemployment rate was 19%. So again, what would the world have to look like for us to say, this isn't working, this is bad? And if you're the attendees here, I think this is pretty obvious, it shouldn't be a surprise that FDR clearly took the United States the closest it had been to peacetime central planning of the economy in U.S. history. So we shouldn't be surprised that that was the worst economic performance in peacetime in U.S. history. Right? That this is, if you think socialism doesn't work, then almost socialism is also going to be pretty bad. And so this is standard stuff. Now let me spend some time, as I say, developing the discussion about foreign policy, and in the remarks later I'll come back more on economics, but let me here just paint something. Again, I'm not a military historian, I don't claim to have expertise in this area, and I want to just show you the pattern, right? So let me first start with something I think most of us can agree on, that what happens when progressive leftists come in and they see some social problem domestically, illiteracy, crime, poverty, things like this that they don't like and they want to fix it, high drug abuse, things of this nature, and they want to fix it. What do? They start tinkering, they start meddling with the economy, they start overturning the existing patterns, they take money from people, they violate conventional property rights, spend a bunch of money because they think they know better. They're real arrogant, they're coming from D.C., and what typically happens, I think most people here would agree, they make things worse, and on top of it, it causes unintended consequences and spawns other problems that then their successors in office down the road are going to point to and say, see, the market doesn't work on its own. That's why we need a strong, aggressive government. So just to take one example that has some relevance to FDR, let's take like healthcare, health insurance. Again, I'm just building an analogy here because I want to then flip it over and show you that mentality when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. So again, we're talking about domestic policy, something like healthcare. A progressive leftist who voted for Obama when he was first running is going to say the free market in healthcare clearly doesn't work. Look at all these uninsured Americans. We need a big government to come in. You ideologues on the right think that the market works. No, it doesn't. There's all these sick people. You're just going to ignore that. And then so what would you say is a standard representative of free market economics? You would say, on the contrary, we have had nothing but successively larger interventions in the health sector from the government. Going back at least to World War II, the alleged paragon of liberty, FDR, had wage and price controls. That was one of the things that happened during the war, and that's why it became standard for employers to give health insurance to their employees because that wasn't considered as part of the compensation. So that was one like a loophole way to get around the wage controls. If you want to attract high-quality employees during World War II, you couldn't increase the amount you paid them. That was illegal. People in Washington said you couldn't do that. So what you could do is boost health care. You could pay for their health insurance. So that's partly why it became standard in the U.S. that employees got their health insurance from their employer, and then that started driving up costs, right? If there's third parties paying for something, you've severed the link between the customer and the provider. That's part of the reason that healthcare costs were rising more rapidly than just general price inflation. And then, now it's unaffordable for the average person. And if you lose your job, you need it. So, there's all these millions of unemployed, or all these millions of people, elderly, who can't get health insurance or it's too expensive. So we have to have Medicare and Medicaid. That comes in and it just exacerbates the problems. Then in the 80s, Ronald Reagan comes in actually and signs legislation that forces hospitals to treat people regardless of whether they can pay for it or not. So just all these things that cause problems to fester and to cause unintended consequences, such that when President Obama was first elected, we clearly did not have a free market in health care, and it was prior rounds of government intervention that caused all of these legitimate social problems, right? It's not that the leftist progressives were making stuff up when they said there's a problem here. It's just they were wrong in thinking all we need is for the government to intervene a little bit more and they'll get it right this time, we promise. Then we'll fix it. No, you know that as they keep ramping it up, it's just going to cause more problems. And so I would submit to you, be consistent. That use that same mentality. And of course, the problems are different, right? Some Hitler rampaging through Europe is not the same thing as people who can't afford health insurance. I'm not trying to say you would necessarily need to use the same policy approach to both. But what I'm asking you is to be consistent and realize that all the stuff that's standard fare for us when it comes to free market economics, where we look at the seen and the unseen, as Bastiat told us to do, right? So if the government just spends money and builds a stadium, it's not enough just to say, oh, I like that stadium. By the same token, if Franklin Roosevelt leads the country into war and defeats Hitler, it's not enough just to say, was Hitler a good guy or a bad guy? You have to ask, what were the consequences of that? Let's try to imagine what would the world look like if the U.S. hadn't done that. All right, now this is...
Got to call time.
Okay.
One
sentence?
One sentence.
One sentence. So think of it this way, and I apologize, it's going to sound glib, but I'm trying to shock you just to make sure in case you never thought of it this way. If you're saying the U.S. had to go into World War II to stop Hitler because he was an evil dictator killing millions of his own people who was going to try to take over Europe, look what happened. That empowered Stalin, an evil dictator who killed millions of his people and took over half of Europe. All right, so again, there's no easy choices here, but I would ask people, it's the same people. If you don't trust the government to spend money to fix domestic problems, why would you give them nuclear weapons and think they'll fix the world and make it safe for democracy? It's the same people. If you don't trust them domestically, you shouldn't trust them in foreign policy. Thank you.
Well, that was some sentence. I counted 3 semicolons in it. So they've each gone a little over 11 minutes, but the 5-minute rebuttal, Mr. Black is up next. At 4.5 minutes, I'll say, wrap up, or 30 seconds. So we'll keep this to 5 minutes. Mr. Black, your rebuttal to what you just heard.
Yes, I've moved my clock from behind the apparatus, so it's right in front of me now, and I will be more self-disciplined than I was. I think Mr. Murphy has muddied the waters considerably. I would remind him, although I imagine it's not really necessary, that the United States entered the war as a result of Japan attacking it without warning and the German government declaring war on it in a rambling speech delivered by Hitler in which he blamed everything, including the fact that the United States had provoked him supposedly to war because of the subversive antics of the domestic Jewish population of the U.S. That is the nature of what we were dealing with. And the alternative to American involvement in the war was not, as was implied, a handing over of the preeminent position in Europe from Hitler to Stalin, who was not an improvement. It was having the entire Eurasian landmass dominated by the two of them, entrenched, immovable, and in the Far East, the Japanese. He referred, in I thought I must say a rather misleading way, to large-scale internment camps. The internment of the Japanese Americans was an absolute disgrace, but it is an example of war hysteria. Roosevelt supported it. Our dear friends on the left have airbrushed out of history the fact that the chief opponent was J. Edgar Hoover, who said he had absolutely honeycombed their organizations. There was no sabotage, no espionage. They were citizens, they had rights, but he was bulldozed, and not only by Roosevelt, by those great liberals, Felix Frankfurter, John McCloy, Henry L. Stimson, a Republican, who was the war secretary, and ultimately the Supreme Court by a vote of 6-3. It is a disgrace on the country, but they weren't concentration camps. They were healthy, and families were kept together. It was an outrage, but to drop the phrase large-scale internment camps as if the United States was governed in a way somehow reminiscent of certain techniques in the totalitarian countries was, with respect, sir, irresponsible. I agree that the coercive handling of the move from the gold standard was excessive. I would not cite John Flynn, who, as you must know, is a completely spurious, raving, foaming at the mouth fruitcake and cannot be taken seriously. In fact, the agriculture program was voted on by farmers according to what they farmed, tobacco, cotton, etc. They agreed on reductions of volumes, transfer into a soil bank that prevented the unused land from going to drought so that prices could be sustained, and it was done by democratic vote. And it was actually not oppressive. It was very, very fair, and it worked. Of course, the National Recovery Act was largely rubbish, the distribution of the Blue Eagles, but it was part of encouraging greater collective bargaining and greater cartelism at the same time to get both prices and wages up. That's what the idea was. Roosevelt himself was relieved when the Supreme Court struck it down. And Johnson, the head of it, retired singing an opera as his retirement address, by the way. But we must not paint Roosevelt as a socialist or an enemy of freedom. He wanted to make, as he said it privately, America safe for people who lived in 30-room houses on 1,000-acre estates, as he did. He said it's hard for men with 5 children and 10 servants to make both ends meet. He cut the welfare allotments in the summer. He said nobody starves in this country in the summertime. He was no bleeding heart. He didn't like paying money just to the unemployed. He would pay them to do work. He would be appalled at what the system hung day by many people, though not by Mr. Murphy and what he said, has degenerated into taking money from people who've earned it and giving it to people who haven't in exchange for their votes. He'd be disgusted by that. It's not what he wanted to do. But on the unemployment numbers, I want to make this point. My contention is that those who were in the workfare program are not unemployed. And the only subsequent biographer of Roosevelt, to me, Gene Edward Smith, a very, very able historian, took up my point and agreed with me. I think as historians, as analysts of that era, historians and economists, we have been chumps in the West, chumps for accepting the nonsense, the lies of Hitler that he abolished unemployment when all he did was conscript everyone into the armed forces and the defense production industries, and that we in your country, in the United States, we did the same here in Canada, failed because in fact, we allowed people who were being paid, were not unemployed, were employed in useful work, providing infrastructure and conservation activities for the whole population and the benefit of the population at a bargain price to the taxpayer.
Pardon me. I have to end now.
No, that's fine.
Keep on schedule. Okay. And by the way, we will have time for a few questions. I want to inform the sound people backstage that after Robert Murphy's presentation, we can open up to a microphone questions. Robert.
Okay, let me, again, in the interest of time here, I'm going to have to hit these points pretty quickly. So let me follow that thread of what he was mentioning there at the end. And so I certainly agree with Mr. Black that by no means should we credit Hitler by saying, oh, yeah, well, at least he got rid of the unemployment problem, because it's easy to cure unemployment if you just grab millions of people who can't find work in the private sector and give them guns and say, here, go shoot those people, and their problem's solved. But what's ironic is that is also, and Mr. Black didn't get into it here, but certainly let me just address this in case you have a lingering concern, this claim that, well, maybe it wasn't the New Deal per se that ended the Depression, but it was certainly the entry into World War II and the massive spending, and that brought down unemployment, and the GDP figures went through the roof, so clearly that ended the Depression. That actually is a very dubious proposition, and it's similar for the same reason that it's wrong, and so again, Mr. Black and I agree, to credit Hitler with curing his unemployment problem. As Bob Higgs points out in his scholarly treatment of this issue, Bob Higgs is an economic historian with the Independent Institute, that the figures in the United States, if you run the numbers, it's actually that for expanding the armed forces, the official ranks of the unemployed went down by a smaller number. So it wasn't even 1-to-1. And so that it was, if you agree with the concept that just taking people and drafting them and then shipping them across the ocean isn't really solving the unemployment problem. That's true of the United States as well, just looking at the figures, that the expansion of the men-at-arms was larger than the drop in the official ranks of the unemployed. And so that's a very perverse way to try to solve the unemployment problem. And as far as the GDP statistics go, if you disaggregate it and look in terms of government spending versus private sector GDP, actually in the height of World War II, so like 43 and 44, private GDP, according to the government's own statistics, was lower in total than it had been back in 32 and 33, the depths of the Great Depression, right? And so what that's saying is in terms of actual consumer goods that civilians were getting, nylons and things like that, meat and so forth, that was worse. There was more privation at the height of World War II. And so if you don't trust the GDP statistics, and Mark Skousen, of course, is famous for showing the flaws in those calculations, that just because the government goes and spends millions of dollars on tanks, that's not the same thing as when consumers voluntarily go into the marketplace and spend millions of dollars on consumer products. That's really not the same measurement. And so I would argue, and many free market economists would agree, is that really the Great Depression did not really end in any meaningful sense until after the war, when the federal government pulled back and reduced its footprint in U.S. society. And again, that shouldn't surprise us. That actually makes sense. It would be weird if massive military expenditures, you might say they were necessary, but it would be odd if that fixed the economy, right? That would be a very Keynesian solution. So if I were speaking to a group of Keynesians, I would try to thread that needle and try to show them, but I just want to point out with this crowd that normally you're skeptical and you realize just massive government expenditures typically misallocates resources, and it's the same thing here. In fact, Paul Krugman likes to point to the military expenditures of World War II as a great example of Keynesianism working. And so I want to say you don't need to worry about that if you can be a consistent free marketeer, you don't have to say it was World War II that ended the Great Depression, because it did not in any meaningful sense. Let me just address, Mr. Black, again, I'm focusing on some of the stuff that's the harder issues. Am I saying what should they have done when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor? Should we just sit there and do it? It's an awful situation. I'm not going to here and glibly say, oh, no, everything would have worked out. But that's, again, analogous to if you were talking to some progressive Democrat who voted for Obama in the 2008 election, and they say, well, given these millions of uninsured, what are we supposed to do? Just let them all die and don't worry, someday the market will fix it? And what would you say? You'd say, well, yeah, it's an awful situation, but we're in this spot because of prior rounds of people thinking like you and thinking Washington is the way to solve it. We just need to give them more power and money. By the same token, it is a completely conventional hypothesis among professional historians that the United States didn't need to go into World War I, and that by doing so, it tipped the balance of power and sowed the seeds for then the rise of Hitler and so on. Again, we can't prove that. We don't know what would have happened, just like we don't know what would have happened in the United States had there not been Medicare and Medicaid, had the government not had wage and price controls in World War II, had there been not occupational licensing on doctors and so forth, and we just let a true free market blossom. But most of us are pretty confident in saying things would have been a lot better in 2008 in terms of health care delivery if there hadn't been those decades of prior government intervention, and we know just meddling more is going to make it worse. So again, here...
You have 30 seconds.
Here, again, the last thing I'll leave you with when it comes to this really tricky problem, it's not enough just to say Hitler and the Japanese emperor, they were bad people and they were doing horrible things. Of course they were. But you have to say, is it so obvious that entering the war and then continuing that path was good? There was almost 300,000 U.S. combat deaths, right? So that's definitely a cost, right? It's not that it was a costless entry. The Cold War quite plausibly linked to the U.S. entry into the war. So all these things that we just take for granted is these exogenous things just happening, and the U.S. has no problem or has no option but to go in and intervene. I'm saying, again, think of it the way you do with domestic policy. These problems that keep popping up are often due to prior rounds of intervention. So just be consistent. It's not as obvious that coming in and FDR entering World War II actually was a boon for liberty. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're welcome to ask your questions. We have a microphone man over here. Just raise your hand and he'll come to you. Keep the statements very short and get right to the question, if you will.
Okay. Roosevelt would not let Jewish refugees come into the country during World War II, and he would not bomb the railroad tracks going to the concentration camps. about what Obama's doing today in the Middle East with Syria and Iraq, Christian refugees?
I believe that's for Mr. Black.
The sound slipped a little, but I think I got the question. It is not the case that President Roosevelt did not accept Jewish refugees. He accepted more refugees than all other countries in the world combined. He accepted approximately 500,000 refugees. When Austria was taken over in the Anschluss and the passports of Austrians outside the country at the time were canceled, he admitted 23,000 Austrians, most of them Jews, at once, even though it was technically unconstitutional. He went as far as he could while preserving the solid coalition of support. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't bad. On the particular matter of the liner St. Louis, a heartbreaking story, the initial problem was that the Distribution Committee in New York, the organization that chiefly handled the Jewish organization to receive fugitives, refugees, didn't pay the bribe required by the Cuban government. In fact, Roosevelt's record was a good one, far better than the scandalous conduct of the governments of Canada and Great Britain. And incidentally, so better than them were a number of dictators such as Franco and the government of Brazil. The comparison with Obama, I think, is not fair for two reasons. One, because I didn't agree with what you said about Roosevelt, but I entirely agree that Obama's conduct in that issue has been terrible, but chiefly because he drew a red line, then tried to abdicate his position as commander-in-chief, and then dumped the whole issue of the Assad regime using sarin gas on its own citizens into the laps of the Russians. And you can't direct the foreign policy of a great power in that way. If the United States, frankly, hadn't smashed up the Middle East, we wouldn't have all these refugees. And as far as I can see, the only candidate who takes any responsibility for the Americans having largely caused this humanitarian disaster is Donald Trump.
We only have 5 minutes left.
The last thing I wanted to say to him is that prior to the end of World War II, Jewish refugees, most of them went to the Dominican Republic, not the United States. After the war is a different story.
We need to move on to the next question over here.
A brief comment to Mr. Black. We wonder why the Great Depression lasted for so long when prior slowdowns had ended so quickly. We begin to wonder whether Roosevelt was prolonging it inadvertently. But in particular, that's just a preamble. In particular, we have this issue of the unemployment rate. I believe that Mr. Murphy said the unemployment rate had fallen to 14% and then ratcheted back to 19%. You're saying not true. If you include all of the people who are working for the government. Could you counter his numbers, 14% and 19%, with your own numbers and tell us where you think? I thought you said 5%, but that sounds a little bit too low. Where would we have been instead of that 19% that Mr. Murphy cited?
I'm grateful for the question because I was going to comment on that too. As I tried to, this is such a big topic. All of us, the questioners and Mr. Murphy and I, have a challenge trying to condense things into the time we have. But I think he and I agree on where it got to in 1936, and it was 5% if you count the workfare people as employed. The so-called Roosevelt recession that he referred to occurred because he threw some raw meat to that faction in his party, the Henry Morgenthau, Lewis Douglas faction, that wanted reduced welfare payments, a narrowing deficit, and getting closer to a balanced budget. He did it. It produced the results that Mr. Murphy quite accurately described. He reversed field, accelerated again the workfare programs. The figures came down to under 10% by conventional measurement of unemployment. That's a number we've had in recent years, under 10% prior to Election Day 1940, and again, if you take the workfare people in, it was down to about 4%. And of those remaining people, they were all getting something from Social Security, which didn't exist before 1935. But in that year between the 40 election and Pearl Harbor, unemployment was eliminated by conventional methods. There was no unemployment before the country mobilized for war. He drafted 1 million people, but that's all. The armed forces weren't 13 million as they were when he died in 1945. And that is my reply to Mr. Murphy's comments on the subject as well. Roosevelt always did the necessary to preserve his political coalition. That's why he was neutral in the Spanish Civil War. He didn't approve of Franco, but he knew that 80% of American Roman Catholics supported the Loyalists in Spain, and 80% of them voted for him. And that's why he didn't defend them. And the reward was that in 5 days before the 1940 election, subsequent Cardinal Spellman read a statement that was read in every service in every Roman Catholic church in the United States, which emphatically supported the president's policy without directly endorsing him as an individual.
And we're running out of time, so I'll have Robert Murphy respond for a second to that question.
Yeah, let me just make 2 quick points on that. So, yes, there is this dispute over how do you measure the unemployment. So the numbers I was citing are what, like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, those were the official numbers. Mr. Black is right, though, that wasn't counting people who were doing certain jobs, like public works projects. The rationale for that, though, to defend the legitimacy of the standard numbers is to say there's a difference if somebody is on the government payroll working like at a public school as a teacher. You're not getting money simply because, oh my gosh, there's so many unemployed, we got to do something for relief. Whereas a lot of these millions of people, they were getting money because they wanted to do something about these masses of unemployed. And so that was the logic. The other thing is, again, we can quibble over the numbers, but why years into it do we have this problem? In prior recessions or depressions with a small d, wage rates dropped quickly, and that cleared the labor markets. Under Herbert Hoover and FDR, they deliberately kept nominal wage rates up. And that's what caused these festering problems, and we can quibble over the numbers, but the ultimate reason is they meddled with the market, and so that's why the labor market stopped working.
Thank you very much for joining us from Skype via technology. We appreciate it. And please thank both of our panelists right now. Thank you.